The hospital said my husband died because of a mistake. A small one, they said. Something that just happens. But here's what they didn't expect. I asked for his medical records. Then I asked for the timestamps. Then I noticed things that didn't match. Medications he never received. Notes written after he was already dead. Charts that quietly changed overnight. That's when I stopped grieving and started digging. They called it a medical error. I called the coroner. They called it a medical error. I called it murder. The hospital said my husband's death was unfortunate. They used that word like it was soft, like it was something you could fold up and put away. But nothing about that night was soft. I remember the sound first, the beeping, steady, calm, too calm for a man who could barely breathe. I was sitting in a plastic chair beside his bed, holding his hand. His skin felt colder than it should have. I kept rubbing his fingers, like that might bring the warmth back. "Can you hear me?" I asked him. He nodded once, barely. That was the last time my husband ever answered me. This is Stories Her Heart Holds, a place where real lives are told honestly, and where silence doesn't win. My husband's name was Thomas. He was 70 years old, and he was not dying. Yes, he had aches and pains. Yes, he complained about his knees, but he walked every morning. He laughed easily. He planned our garden for spring. We had been married for 46 years. 46 years of shared meals, folded laundry, and quiet routines that felt permanent. We lived in a small town in Ohio. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. The day Thomas went to the hospital, we expected to be home by evening. Chest pain, that was the phrase the nurse used on the phone. "Bring him in," she said, "just to be safe." So I drove. I remember gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The radio was playing a cheerful song that felt wrong for the moment. At the emergency room, everything moved fast. Too fast to explain. Too fast to ask questions. They put him on a bed. They attached wires. They asked him to rate his pain. 6, he said. I watched the nurse write something else. I noticed that. I didn't understand it yet, but I noticed. Hours passed, then more hours. A young doctor came in. He spoke quickly, using words that floated past me. Probably indigestion, maybe anxiety. We'll monitor. Monitor. That word would matter later. They admitted Thomas overnight. Just to be safe, they said again. I went home to rest, or at least I tried. At 2:13 in the morning, my phone rang. When a hospital calls that late, your body knows before your mind does. Your stomach drops, your chest tightens. "Mrs. Carter, you should come in." No explanation, no comfort. When I arrived, Thomas was already gone. They told me his heart stopped. They told me they tried everything. They told me sometimes these things just happen. One nurse wouldn't meet my eyes. Another kept repeating, "I'm sorry," like it was scripted. I stood there looking at my husband's face, and something felt wrong. He didn't look peaceful. He looked surprised. At the funeral, people said kind things. He lived a good life. At least he didn't suffer. But I kept hearing the beeping. I kept seeing the nurse look away. A week later, a letter arrived from the hospital. Cause of death, medical wording, no details. They included a brochure for grief counseling. That made me angry. I didn't want counseling. I wanted answers. So I requested his medical records. They said it would take 30 days. It took 47. The envelope was thick when it arrived. Too thick. I spread the papers across our dining table, the same table where Thomas and I had shared meals for decades. At first, it looked like noise. Charts, numbers, codes. Then I noticed something strange. Times didn't match. Medications appeared that I never saw given. Notes written by doctors who never spoke to us. One page said his pain was mild. Another said severe. Same time, same hour. I circled things in red pen. Then I did something women like me are not encouraged to do. I asked questions. I called the hospital. I asked for patient services. They were polite, very polite. They said records can be confusing. They said charts are updated later. They said not to read too much into it. Sometimes, the woman said softly, these things are just errors. That word again, error, like a typo, like a spill. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, holding Thomas's old watch. It had stopped ticking the night he died. I thought about his last words. Something doesn't feel right. The next morning, I called the coroner. I didn't know I could do that. No one tells you that you can. I asked for an independent review. There was a pause. Then the man said, "We don't get many of those." A few days later, a woman knocked on my door. She worked in medical coding. Her hands were shaking. "I shouldn't be here," she said, "but I saw your request." She told me charts could be changed after death. She told me it happened more than people knew. They adjusted things after, she said. I understood then. My husband wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Before I end this part, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told to stay quiet when something felt wrong? After the woman from medical coding left my house, I didn't move for a long time. I sat at the dining table, staring at the papers spread in front of me. The room felt different now, like the walls had leaned in closer. I wasn't imagining things anymore. Someone else had seen it too. That changed everything. For the first time since Thomas died, I wasn't just a widow. I was a witness. I made coffee I didn't drink. I picked up pages, put them down, then picked them up again. The coding woman's words kept repeating in my head. They adjusted things after. I went back to the charts with fresh eyes. This time, I wasn't reading like a grieving wife. I was reading like someone looking for fingerprints. I noticed how neat the changes were. Different handwriting, different ink, same dates. Some notes were clearly written later but stamped earlier, timestamps that didn't follow the order of events. At 6:40 p.m., Thomas was listed as stable. At 6:42 p.m., a medication appeared that should have lowered his blood pressure. But no nurse had come in then. I was sitting right there. At 7:10 p.m., the chart said his pain was minimal. At 7:12 p.m., an alert showed patient distress. Which was it? You don't need medical school to know something was wrong. I called the hospital again. This time, I asked to speak to the charge nurse from that night. They put me on hold, long enough to make me feel foolish. When she finally came on the line, her voice was tight. "I don't remember your husband specifically," she said. I didn't believe her. I asked about the medication listed at 6:42. She hesitated. "That's standard protocol," she said. I asked why it was given when his blood pressure was already low. Another pause. That decision would have been made by the attending physician. I asked for the physician's name. She said she couldn't share that. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. They were closing ranks. Over the next few days, I started doing something new. I started keeping a notebook. Every call, every name, every pause. I wrote down the dates, the excuses, the phrases they used again and again. Standard, unfortunate, error. One afternoon, I took the records to a retired nurse who lived 2 streets over. Her name was Carol. She had worked in hospitals for 30 years. She read quietly. Then she looked up at me and said, "This doesn't make sense." That sentence felt like oxygen. She pointed to a section in the chart. "This medication," she said, "should never have been given without monitoring." She flipped a page. "And this note was added later. I'd bet my pension on it." I asked why someone would do that. She leaned back in her chair. "Because if they discharge him early," she said, "they save money, and if something goes wrong after, they can say it wasn't on them." "But he wasn't discharged," I said. She nodded slowly. "No," she said, "he just didn't live long enough." That night, I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not the quiet tears people expect, the ugly kind. But after the tears came anger, and after the anger came focus. I filed a formal complaint, not just with the hospital, with the state medical board. I included copies of the records, highlighted sections, my notes. 2 weeks passed. Then my phone rang. It was a man from the hospital's legal department. He spoke very carefully. "We understand you have concerns. We're very sorry for your loss." I waited. He offered a meeting. "In person," he said, "to help bring you closure." Closure. That word felt like a door being gently shut. I agreed to the meeting anyway. When I arrived, there were 3 of them: a lawyer, an administrator, a doctor I had never seen before. They spoke in turns. They explained procedures. They explained policies. They explained how complex medicine can be. I listened. Then I slid 1 page across the table. "Explain this," I said. The room went quiet. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "That appears to be a documentation issue," he said. I slid another page. "And this?" Another pause. The administrator smiled thinly. "These things are under review." Then the lawyer spoke. "We'd like to offer a settlement for your pain and suffering." I felt something settle in my chest. They weren't offering answers, they were offering silence. I pushed the papers back to him. "I'm not here for money. I'm here because my husband didn't have to die." The lawyer's smile faded. A week later, my access to the hospital portal was removed. They said it was a system update. Emails I had sent went to unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. That's when the second message came. Not a call, an email, from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Please be careful." The message was short. "They are changing more records. If you want proof, look at the audit logs." I stared at the screen. Someone inside was watching. Someone was afraid. And someone was willing to talk. Before I end this part, I want to say this. If you think systems don't protect themselves, you're wrong. They do. And when they do, they leave people behind. In the next part, I'll tell you how I got the audit logs and what they revealed that no one meant for me to see. The email stayed open on my screen for a long time. Please be careful. Those 3 words changed the air in the room. I read the message again and again, looking for clues. There was no name, no signature, just a warning, and 1 sentence that mattered more than the rest. "If you want proof, look at the audit logs." I didn't know what audit logs were, so I did what I had been doing since Thomas died. I started learning. I searched online late into the night. Simple terms, plain explanations. Audit logs, I learned, are digital footprints. They show who opened a record, who changed it, when, and sometimes why. They were not meant for patients to see, which told me something important. If someone was pointing me there, it meant those logs held answers. The next morning, I called the hospital's records department. I kept my voice calm, polite. I asked if the electronic system kept a history of edits. "Yes," the woman said carefully. I asked if patients could request it. There was a pause. "That's not standard," she said. I told her I was filing a formal request under my rights as next of kin. Another pause. She said she would check. 2 days later, I received a letter. The hospital denied my request. They said audit logs were internal tools and not part of the medical record. That was the moment I stopped asking politely. I contacted a legal aid office in the city. I didn't have money for a lawyer, but I had questions. The woman I spoke to listened quietly. Then she said, "You can subpoena those records." The word felt heavy, serious. She explained I would need to file a civil complaint first. I went home and sat at the kitchen table again. I looked at Thomas's chair, empty. I imagined him there, listening. "You always said I was stubborn," I whispered. "This is me being stubborn." I filed the complaint. The hospital responded fast, too fast. Within a week, I received another call from the legal department. This time, their tone was different, less kind, more firm. They warned me about stress, about my health. They suggested I let professionals handle things. I thanked them and hung up. A few days later, another email arrived. Same address, no name. "They're nervous," it said. "You're closer than you think." Attached was a file. I hesitated before opening it. My heart was pounding. Inside was a screenshot, a list of entries, dates, times, user IDs. Next to Thomas's name were multiple edits, some after his death. One entry stood out, a record change made 3 hours after he was pronounced dead. Reason, clarification. Clarification of what? I printed everything. I spread it across the table. I matched the times to the chart changes I had circled weeks earlier. They lined up perfectly. Someone had gone back. Someone had cleaned up. I took the files to Carol, the retired nurse. She stared at the pages, then slowly shook her head. "This is bad," she said. She pointed to one user ID. "That belongs to a supervisor, not bedside staff." That word echoed in my mind. Supervisor. This wasn't one nurse making a mistake. This wasn't one tired doctor. This was organized. That night I barely slept. Every creak in the house sounded louder. Every car passing felt closer. I started locking the doors earlier. Then something else happened. A letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It listed internal email addresses. At the bottom, one line was handwritten. "Search these names plus discharge targets." My hands trembled as I typed. And there it was. Articles, reports, quiet settlements, hospitals under pressure to shorten stays, bonuses tied to early discharge. I found one document that made my chest tighten. An internal presentation from a healthcare conference. One slide read, "Reducing inpatient time improves revenue outcomes." I thought about Thomas, about how they said he was stable, about how they talked about discharge, about how quickly everything happened. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger. I printed more pages. My house began to look like an investigation room. Files stacked on chairs, notes taped to the wall. And then, one night, my phone rang, a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. The voice on the other end was low, nervous. "I can't talk long," the person said. "They're watching the internal systems." I asked who they were. "I worked the night your husband died. I tried to speak up. My breath caught. They told us to document differently. Not lie, just soften." "Soften?" I repeated. "Yes, so it wouldn't look bad." I asked why they were telling me now. There was silence. Then, "Because I can't sleep anymore." The call ended. I sat in the dark, phone in my hand. This was no longer about suspicion. This was proof, and proof has weight. Before I end this part, I want to tell you something I learned. Systems don't break loudly. They break quietly.
and the people inside them are taught to whisper. In the next part, I'll tell you how the whistleblower stepped forward publicly and how the hospital tried to stop it.
After the phone call, I didn't turn the lights on. I sat in the dark, listening to the quiet of the house. The kind of quiet that feels heavy. Someone had tried to speak up, and someone had been stopped. That meant two things were true at the same time. What happened to Thomas was real, and it was dangerous to expose. The next morning, I received another email. Same address. "They want to scare you," it read. "They don't expect you to keep going." I read that line twice. I wasn't brave, I was tired, but I was also angry in a calm, steady way that doesn't go away. I wrote back, one sentence, "What do you need from me?" The reply came hours later. "I need you to protect me." We met 3 days later, not at my house, not at the hospital, a small cafe near the highway, too busy for private conversations. The woman who walked in looked younger than I expected, late 30s, dark circles under her eyes. She ordered tea and sat across from me. "I am a nurse," she said quietly. "I was on Thomas's floor." She didn't touch her cup. She told me about meetings, about pressure from supervisors. They were told to optimize charts. They were warned about being team players. When patients declined suddenly, they were told to document symptoms as expected. It wasn't written anywhere, she said, but everyone understood. She told me she had raised concerns once. After that, her schedule changed, her shifts were cut. Then came the message she would never forget. "Do you want to keep your job?" That was the moment she stopped talking. Until now. She slid a flash drive across the table. "Emails," she said. "Internal messages." I didn't open it there. I took it home and locked the door. What I saw made my hands go cold. Messages from supervisors reminding staff about discharge targets, reminders to reframe language. One email stood out. "Be mindful of wording after adverse outcomes." After. Another message mentioned Thomas by initials, not his name, just enough to identify him. "He was flagged as high cost," the email read. High cost. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. My husband had been reduced to a line item. That night, I contacted a journalist, a woman, older, known for healthcare investigations. She listened. Then she said, "If we do this, it will get ugly." I told her I understood. We met in person a week later. I brought everything: records, audit logs, emails. She asked careful questions. She didn't rush me. "This isn't just negligence," she said finally. "This is systemic." The article took weeks. During that time, the hospital moved fast. They sent me a letter, a larger settlement offer, with a condition: confidentiality. I didn't respond. Then came the call. A man I didn't know. He warned me about defamation, about lawsuits, about stress. I hung up. The article went live on a Tuesday morning. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Former staff reached out. Families shared similar stories. By the evening, the hospital released a statement. They denied wrongdoing. They promised an internal review. That night, the nurse texted me. "They know it was me," she wrote. Fear settled in my stomach. But something else happened too. The state health department announced a preliminary inquiry, and the hospital's tone changed. They stopped calling. They started watching. Before I end this part, let me say this. When truth goes public, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing in the open, exposed. In the next part, I'll tell you what the investigation uncovered and how far the falsification really went. The investigation didn't start with sirens or headlines. It started quietly. 2 people from the state health department came to my house. a man and a woman, both polite, both serious. They brought notebooks. They asked for copies. They didn't interrupt when I spoke. That alone told me this was different. I showed them everything, the charts, the audit logs, the emails. The woman investigator paused when she saw the timestamps. These edits, she said, were not random. She asked if I knew how many cases were involved. I told her I didn't. She nodded slowly. Neither do we, she said, yet. They left after 2 hours. When the door closed, my knees felt weak. I sat down and realized I was holding my breath. A week later, the journalist called. "They're expanding the story," she said. "There are more families. Some from my state, some from others. Same hospital group, same patterns. Early discharge, sudden decline, charts changed after death." The phrase "isolated incident" disappeared. In its place came a new word: practice. The nurse called me late one night. "They're pulling old files," she said. "Whole years." I imagined rooms full of cabinets being opened, screens lighting up. I imagined names being remembered too late. Then the hospital held a press conference. They stood behind a podium, smiling, calm. They announced a temporary leave for 2 supervisors. Temporary. They promised retraining. No apology, no admission. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. A former administrator contacted the journalist. He had left the hospital 2 years earlier. He said the pressure came from above, from corporate, from numbers. He shared internal reports, charts showing targets, bonuses tied to shorter stays. One line stayed with me. Mortality risk acceptable within margins. Acceptable. Within margins. I read that sentence again and again. Thomas's death had fit inside a margin. The state inquiry widened into a formal probe. Medical licenses were reviewed. Staff were interviewed. Some cried, some denied everything. The nurse was placed on leave. She was told it was temporary. She was never scheduled again. I watched her pay a price for telling the truth. The hospital's lawyers called me, not with threats this time, with a different tone. They wanted to resolve. They offered a settlement large enough to change my life, but the document still included silence. I didn't sign. Then something unexpected happened. A criminal investigator reached out. Not civil, criminal. They wanted to talk about falsification of records. That word hit harder than any headline. Falsification. It meant intent. It meant choice. The day I gave my statement, I wore the same coat I had worn to the hospital the night Thomas died. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to bring him with me. I spoke for 3 hours. I told them about the beeping, the charts, the pauses. When I finished, the investigator closed his notebook. "You did the right thing," he said. I nodded, but I didn't feel relief. I felt tired. Before I end this part, I want you to understand something. Justice doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, and every piece has a cost. In the next part, I'll tell you what the hospital finally admitted and what they still refuse to say. The hospital never said the word murder. They chose their words carefully, very carefully. They released a statement late on a Friday afternoon. That timing was not an accident. In it, they acknowledged documentation inconsistencies. They admitted to process failures. They expressed deep regret. But they did not admit intent. They did not say my husband's name. And they did not apologize to the families. By then, the story had spread. Other hospitals in the network were being examined. Former patients were requesting records. Some found nothing. Some found everything. I received letters, handwritten ones, from widows, from sons, from daughters. They told me about sudden declines, about discharge plans that felt rushed. They asked me how I knew. I told them the truth. I didn't know at first. I just refused to stop asking. The criminal probe moved slower than the public one. That was harder. Waiting is harder than fighting. Weeks passed, then months. Supervisors resigned quietly. No announcements. One doctor lost privileges. No explanation. The nurse finally called me one afternoon. They offered me a settlement, she said, to stay quiet. I asked what she would do. I already lost my job, she said. I won't lose my voice, too. I was proud of her and afraid for her. The stress began to show. I stopped sleeping through the night. My hands shook when the phone rang. Once, a car sat outside my house too long. It was probably nothing, but fear changes how you see things. Then came the call I never expected, from the coroner. He had completed his review. There were discrepancies, he said, in the medication timeline. He paused. I am amending the cause of death. I closed my eyes. He didn't say murder, but he didn't say error either. He said complications following inappropriate clinical management. It wasn't justice, but it was truth moving forward. The hospital increased the settlement again. This time, the silence clause was optional. That told me something important. They knew they were losing control. I accepted the settlement, not because I wanted money, because it allowed me to fund something else, a voice. I worked with the journalists to create a public resource, a simple guide for families, how to request records, what to look for, who to call. I spoke at a community meeting. My hands shook as I stood at the podium, but when I looked out, I saw faces like mine, tired, listening. Before I end this part, I need to say this. Truth doesn't always punish the guilty the way we want, but it protects the next person. In the next part, I'll tell you how this changed my life and why I didn't stop when the case slowed down. After the settlement, people assumed it was over. They said things like, "At least you can rest now. You got closure." They meant well, but they didn't understand. Closure is a word people use when they want your pain to be tidy. Mine wasn't. The house was still quiet. Thomas's chair was still empty. The watch still didn't tick. But something else had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore. Emails kept coming. Families asking for help. Journalists asking for comment. Advocacy groups asking me to speak. At first, I said no. I was tired. My voice felt thin. Then one message stopped me. It was from a woman in her 70s. She wrote, "If I had read your story 2 years ago, my sister might still be alive." I read that sentence until the screen blurred. So I said yes. I learned how to tell the story without shaking, how to explain medical language in plain words. I spoke in church basements, community centers, small halls with folding chairs. I told people what to ask for, what not to sign, when to trust their instincts. I watched heads nod. I watched anger rise. Then focus. The hospital network announced policy changes, new review systems, outside audits. They called it reform. I called it late. Still, it mattered. I was invited to testify at a state hearing. I wore a simple blouse, no jewelry. I spoke slowly. I talked about Thomas as a person, not a case. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone clapped. I didn't look to see who. At home, I started something small, a phone number, a notebook. I returned calls. Sometimes all people needed was permission to trust themselves. The nurse found new work, not in a hospital. She volunteers now. We talk often. We remind each other that fear doesn't mean stop. It means careful. Before I end this part, I want to leave you with this. Grief doesn't disappear, but it can become direction. In the next part, I'll tell you about the criminal case and the moment I realized revenge wasn't what I was after. I never expected an email could shake my entire world, but there it was, blinking in my inbox like a spotlight on every lie the hospital had buried. The subject line alone made my heart jump. For your eyes only, internal memo. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the mouse, my chest tightening. Could this be real? Could someone inside finally be risking everything to tell the truth? My hand clicked, and the screen filled with words that made my blood run cold. They were detailed, meticulous, almost clinical, listing altered charts, falsified discharge notes, even casual references to patients handled quietly. I read it once, then twice, each time expecting the words to rearrange themselves into nonsense, into a misunderstanding. But no, it was all there. Dates, times, staff initials, even patient room numbers. Every inconsistency I had noticed in my late husband's chart was spelled out plainly, as though someone had taken the time to document every deception just for me. My hands shook. I had been labeled paranoid. I had been accused of imagining things. And yet, here was proof, tangible and undeniable. The email came with a note, unsigned but urgent. If you want justice, move carefully. They are watching. A chill ran down my spine. The words didn't just warn, they threatened. I realized the whistleblower wasn't merely sharing information, they were entrusting me with a weapon I had to wield wisely. But how? Where would I even begin? I was just one woman, an ordinary wife, suddenly holding the kind of evidence that could topple careers, ruin reputations, and expose systemic corruption. I set the email aside and leaned back in my chair, breathing heavily. I thought of Ernest, lying in that sterile hospital bed, fading away while those sworn to care for him had turned their attention elsewhere. I thought of the discharge papers, the altered medications, the notes that vanished like smoke. I had mourned him, yes, but now grief twisted into rage, sharp and burning. I couldn't just weep anymore. This was beyond sorrow. This was a battle, and I was ready to fight. The next morning, I returned to the hospital, pretending to be calm. I needed access to more records, but I had to be careful. I couldn't let anyone see that I was armed with knowledge. Every nurse I passed, every doctor who nodded politely, became part of a theater in which I was the lead actress, performing the role of a grieving widow, innocent and trusting, while inside I was plotting, calculating, analyzing. I spent hours in the library, cross-referencing patient files, piecing together patterns, tracing the same initials, the same methods, the same careless missteps that had taken Ernest's life. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally. Sometimes I would pause, head in my hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. But then I would remember the email, the trust someone had placed in me, and I would straighten up, determined. I realized that exposing this wasn't just about Ernest anymore. It was about everyone who would come after him, about families who would be deceived, lied to, and left alone in sterile rooms, believing their loved ones were being cared for, when in reality, the system itself was failing. Late one evening, I received another message. This time, it contained scanned PDFs of internal communications between senior staff, written in an almost flippant tone that made my stomach turn. They joked about keeping the numbers down and expediting difficult cases, language that revealed a shocking casualness toward life and death. I read the words over and over, each sentence making me feel like I was drowning in betrayal. How could people trained to heal, to save lives, speak like this? How could they laugh while others suffered? I decided it was time to involve someone beyond the hospital walls. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice and whistleblower protection. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to gauge their reaction. The lawyer's eyes widened as I handed over printed copies of the emails, the charts, and the internal memos. "This," they said, voice low and serious, "is not just negligence, this is criminal." The words reverberated in my chest. Criminal. It was the word I had been searching for, the one that finally named what had been done to my husband. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with the lawyer, meticulously compiling evidence, noting discrepancies, highlighting falsified records. Every day, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear of retaliation, of being watched, followed, or silenced, and exhilaration at finally taking control of a situation that had left me powerless for so long. I learned to anticipate the hospital's moves, to predict how they might try to discredit me, to cover their tracks further. I became a detective, a strategist, and an advocate, all rolled into one weary but determined body. Then came the day I met the whistleblower in person. We arranged to meet in a quiet cafe, mid-morning, before the lunch crowd arrived. I remember sitting at the corner table, eyes scanning the door every few seconds, heart hammering. A woman in her early 40s, professional but tense, approached, clutching a briefcase as though it contained her very life. She sat down and looked at me, eyes wary but resolute. "I knew you'd do the right thing," she said, softly, voice barely above a whisper. We spoke for hours, sharing details that had been hidden from the public eye, recounting moments that no one outside the hospital would ever believe. She revealed how staff had been pressured to meet quotas, how mistakes were brushed under the rug, how patients' families were systematically manipulated into believing everything was fine. The depth of deception was staggering, and as I listened, I felt a wave of sorrow for all the lives touched by this cold, calculated negligence. But amidst the sadness, there was hope. Hope that justice could be served, that exposure could prevent further harm, that our combined efforts might force accountability. We devised a plan to approach authorities carefully, to protect both ourselves and any other potential whistleblowers. We compiled emails, memos, and charts into a secure file, a dossier that would stand as undeniable proof of systemic wrongdoing. Every piece of paper, every digital record felt like a brick in the wall of truth we were constructing. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The hospital began to sense that something was brewing, subtle changes in tone during phone calls, the way staff avoided my gaze, the unspoken tension in hallways. But I remained outwardly calm, smiling, nodding, participating in routines, while inside, I was building a case so strong it could not be ignored. I spent late nights double-checking records, cross-referencing timestamps, and organizing evidence, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. And then, just when I felt the plan solidifying, an unexpected twist arrived. A former nurse, who had left the hospital months earlier, reached out anonymously. She claimed to have additional documentation that could prove beyond doubt that early discharges and falsified charts were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader, long-standing culture of negligence. The excitement was tempered by fear. Sharing this information could put her at risk, but the importance of truth outweighed the danger. Together, we ensured her files were securely transferred to our dossier, adding another layer of evidence. I began to notice the small changes in myself during this period, the fire in my eyes, the steadiness in my voice, the unwavering determination. Grief had transformed into purpose. Each email, each document, each conversation was a step towards justice. I felt as if Ernest was guiding me, urging me to continue when exhaustion threatened to consume me. Every morning, I awoke with a renewed sense of mission, to expose the corruption, to demand accountability, and to prevent another family from enduring the heartbreak I had lived through. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one hospital or one patient. It was about an entire system that allowed profit, convenience, and bureaucracy to override human life. And I, a woman who had once felt powerless, had become a force to challenge it. The emails, the whistleblowers, the evidence, they were no longer just documents, they were instruments of justice. Instruments that, if used wisely, could force change, reform policies, and shine a light on the darkest corners of healthcare. By the end of Part 8, I had transformed. I was no longer merely a widow seeking answers. I was an activist, an investigator, a guardian for those who might otherwise be overlooked or ignored. And as I prepared to take the next step, to present our findings to authorities and the world, I felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. But above all, I felt something I hadn't in months: hope. Hope that truth, once buried, could finally rise. Hope that justice, delayed though it might be, was possible. Because sometimes the smallest act, opening a single email, can ignite a chain reaction powerful enough to topple walls built on lies. And I, armed with courage, determination, and a relentless sense of duty, was ready to see it through. The moment we submitted the dossier to the authorities, the weight of anticipation hit me like a tidal wave. For weeks, I had been gathering evidence, interviewing whistleblowers, cross-referencing charts, and now it all lay in the hands of investigators. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but inside, my nerves were taut as a wire. I kept imagining the hospital discovering our actions, retaliating, or worse, trying to discredit us. I knew they would not go down quietly. It didn't take long for the first signs to appear. Phone calls with unfamiliar numbers started coming at odd hours. Emails were deleted, or so it seemed, as if someone was trying to erase digital footprints. My mailbox began receiving anonymous letters, thin, folded, without return addresses, each one a vague threat warning me to stop, to back down. My heart would race and my hands would shake as I read them, but fear, oddly enough, didn't paralyze me. It fueled my determination. I remember one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, documents spread out before me like a war map, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I had a cup of tea growing cold beside me, untouched. Every detail of Ernest's last days played through my mind: the way his breathing had sounded that morning, the nurse's distant expressions, the discharged instructions that made no sense. Grief lingered at the edges, but it had transformed into focus, a singular drive to make the hospital answer for what had happened. The media soon caught wind of whispers surrounding the investigation. Reporters called incessantly, some polite, others intrusive. I had to tread carefully. Any misstep could undermine the case or even place our whistleblowers at risk. My lawyer advised minimal comment, and yet I felt a pull to speak, to ensure the truth wasn't obscured by corporate spin or legal jargon. I wanted the public to understand the human cost of negligence, the lives affected, the families shattered, the silent suffering that occurred behind hospital walls. Then came the first official pushback from the hospital. I received a formal letter, 10 pages of carefully worded accusations, insinuations that I had falsified evidence, that I was motivated by personal gain, that I had no standing to make these claims. Reading it, I felt my stomach churn with anger. They were trying to twist the narrative, to smear me, to undermine my credibility. But beneath my anger, I noticed a small spark of satisfaction. They were worried. They feared the truth reaching the light, and that fear meant we were striking at something real. The authorities began their own investigation. Inspectors visited, asked questions, compared documents, and interviewed staff. Some employees were cooperative, hesitant, but ultimately truthful, while others maintained silence, eyes flicking nervously, hiding behind legal teams and hospital policies. I realized then just how entrenched the deception was, how fear had allowed wrongdoing to persist for years. Yet each time a staff member admitted to irregularities, a small victory surged through me. Evidence, I realized, was truth given flesh. One particularly tense day, I met with the lead investigator in a sterile government office. I handed over a fresh set of notes, carefully organized and annotated. The investigator studied them, nodding, occasionally jotting down a note. "This is comprehensive," he said finally. "It's rare we see such a meticulous record from a private citizen. You've done a lot of the legwork for us." Hearing that, I felt a mixture of pride and relief. Ernest's death had been a tragedy, but now his story had the power to change a system. The hospital's countermeasures escalated. Social media posts subtly attacked my character. Opinion pieces appeared in local papers, casting doubt on my motives. Anonymous tips tried to discredit the whistleblowers, labeling them disgruntled or unreliable. I learned quickly that the fight wasn't just legal, it was a battle for narrative control, a war of perception. Each day I braced myself, reminded of the stakes, but every attempt they made to intimidate me only reinforced my commitment. I couldn't allow them to manipulate the truth or silence those brave enough to come forward. I spent long nights strategizing with my lawyer, planning the next steps. We discussed contacting higher authorities, exploring civil litigation, and securing protective measures for the whistleblowers. Each document, each email, each testimony became a brick in a fortress of accountability, and slowly the fortress grew stronger. I began to feel less like a grieving widow and more like an agent of justice, a force standing against a system that had failed so many. Amid the chaos, I received an unexpected note from a former nurse, someone I hadn't heard from in months. She described an incident similar to Ernest's case, something that had been quietly handled but left a patient seriously harmed. She provided detailed documentation and insisted on anonymity. Her courage bolstered my spirit. I realized this wasn't just about my husband or a single hospital. It was about shining a light on a culture of negligence and ensuring it never persisted unchecked. Then the strain of constant vigilance began to take a toll. My sleep became irregular, dreams haunted by hospital corridors and unanswered calls. I would wake heart pounding, convinced I had overlooked a critical detail or misfiled a piece of evidence. Fear of retaliation lingered at the edges of every day. Yet, even in these moments of exhaustion, I found a strange comfort in the work. It gave my grief purpose, transforming it from passive sorrow into active advocacy. And then came the breakthrough. The authorities confirmed they had uncovered a series of falsified records, matched patterns across multiple patients, and were preparing to file criminal charges against several staff members. It was a validation of all the late nights, all the painstaking research, all the courage of whistleblowers who had risked their careers to speak the truth. I felt a tremor of triumph, tempered by the somber knowledge that no amount of justice could bring Ernest back. The hospital tried one last tactic, a direct approach. My lawyer informed me that their legal team requested a private meeting to resolve differences. I was wary. Any interaction carried risk. I declined in person, opting instead for written communication. They offered settlements, hush money, even veiled apologies. But I had learned by now that money could not undo betrayal. It could not restore trust. I refused. My goal had never been personal gain. It had been truth, accountability, and reform. The public response began to swell. Stories and local news highlighted the investigation, giving voice to families affected by similar cases. Social media amplified experiences that had previously been hidden, and pressure mounted on the hospital to cooperate fully. I watched as the narrative shifted from my husband's tragedy to systemic reform and realized that our efforts were creating change far beyond what I had imagined. During this period, I also received a personal note from a former nurse, someone I hadn't heard from in months. She described an incident similar to Ernest's case, something that had been quietly handled but left a patient seriously harmed. She provided detailed documentation and insisted on anonymity. Her courage bolstered my spirit. I realized this wasn't just about my husband or a single hospital. It was about shining a light on a culture of negligence and ensuring it never persisted unchecked. Then the strain of constant vigilance began to take a toll. My sleep became irregular, dreams haunted by hospital corridors and unanswered calls. I would wake heart pounding, convinced I had overlooked a critical detail or misfiled a piece of evidence. Fear of retaliation lingered at the edges of every day.
Yet, even in these moments of exhaustion, I found a strange comfort in the work. It gave my grief purpose, transforming it from passive sorrow into active advocacy. And then came the breakthrough. The authorities confirmed they had uncovered a series of falsified records, matched patterns across multiple patients, and were preparing to file criminal charges against several staff members. It was a validation of all the late nights, all the painstaking research, all the courage of whistleblowers who had risked their careers to speak the truth. I felt a tremor of triumph, tempered by the somber knowledge that no amount of justice could bring Ernest back. The hospital tried one last tactic, a direct approach. My lawyer informed me that their legal team requested a private meeting to resolve differences. I was wary. Any interaction carried risk. I declined in person, opting instead for written communication. They offered settlements, hush money, even veiled apologies. But I had learned by now that money could not undo betrayal. It could not restore trust. I refused. My goal had never been personal gain. It had been truth, accountability, and reform. The public response began to swell. Stories in local news highlighted the investigation, giving voice to families affected by similar cases. Social media amplified experiences that had previously been hidden, and pressure mounted on the hospital to cooperate fully. I watched as the narrative shifted from my husband's tragedy to systemic reform, and realized that our efforts were creating change far beyond what I had imagined. During this period, I also received a personal note from a former nurse, someone I hadn't heard from in months. She described an incident similar.
The day the settlement was announced, I remember feeling a mixture of relief, vindication, and an almost dizzying exhaustion. Months of painstaking research, sleepless nights, and emotional turmoil had led to this moment. The hospital had admitted partial responsibility, and several staff members were facing criminal probes. The news headlines screamed of medical malpractice and corruption exposed, but I didn't read them immediately. I couldn't let the media spin or sensationalize my grief. I wanted to feel it quietly, in my own way. I walked into the quiet of my living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. I sat down, finally letting my shoulders relax, and allowed myself a single deep breath. For so long, I had carried anger, sorrow, and disbelief like a physical weight pressing down on me. But in that moment, I realized something profound. Ernest's story, our story, had power. It had sparked change, held people accountable, and illuminated a system that had hidden its darkest corners for far too long. The legal settlement, while significant, was never the goal. It was a tool, a confirmation that the evidence we had gathered was undeniable. More importantly, it was a signal that systemic reform was possible. The authorities promised oversight, stricter protocols, and mandatory training to prevent the kind of negligence that had stolen my husband's life. I knew these measures wouldn't undo the past, wouldn't bring Ernest back, but they could protect others. And somehow that knowledge offered a fragile kind of peace. I received a call from one of the whistleblowers, the woman who had first trusted me with her secret. Her voice trembled with relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." I smiled through tears, knowing she had risked everything, her career, her safety, her sense of security, to expose the truth. "No," I said softly, "we did it together, for Ernest, for every family, for every patient who couldn't speak for themselves." Media attention intensified after the settlement and criminal probes became public. Interviews, news features, and social media discussions filled my days. Each story repeated the same shocking phrase. What was called a medical error was, in fact, deliberate negligence. Families reached out to me, some seeking advice, others simply sharing their heartbreak and gratitude. Their stories mirrored my own grief, but they also reinforced the importance of speaking up, of demanding accountability, of refusing to let injustice slide silently into the shadows. I began to understand the full scope of the impact. Hospitals and healthcare providers across the region implemented stricter oversight measures, updated training programs, and created anonymous reporting channels to prevent retaliation. My fight, born of personal tragedy, had created ripples that extended far beyond Ernest's case, and while nothing could erase the pain of loss, knowing that others might be spared a similar fate brought a quiet, hard-won satisfaction. Still, there were moments when the weight of what had happened returned, unbidden. Nights when I would awaken, the memory of Ernest's last breaths vivid in my mind, the sterile smell of the hospital rooms still lingering in imagination. I would reach for him, only to remember the empty space beside me. Grief, I realized, doesn't vanish. It evolves, it transforms, coexisting with purpose, activism, and the small victories that honor those we have lost. I took to writing about my experience, documenting the process of uncovering negligence, navigating the legal system, and exposing corruption. I wanted others to understand the importance of vigilance, the necessity of advocacy, and the courage required to confront institutions that seemed untouchable. Each story I wrote, each blog post or article I published, was another tool to educate and empower, to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same heartbreak without recourse. The criminal probe continued, and I attended hearings when I could. Watching the process unfold, seeing those responsible face accountability was both painful and necessary. It reminded me that justice is not instantaneous. It is deliberate, painstaking, and sometimes slow, but when it arrives, it carries the weight of truth and the assurance that integrity, however delayed, is ultimately recognized. I also became involved in advocacy groups, joining forces with other families affected by medical negligence. Together, we lobbied for legislative reforms, presented cases to hospital boards, and spoke at conferences about patient rights, transparency, and ethical responsibility. Every time I stood before a crowd, sharing Ernest's story, I felt his presence beside me, not in a physical sense, but in the guiding force of purpose and love that had fueled my journey from despair to action. One afternoon, as I sat by my favorite window overlooking the garden, I reflected on the journey. It had begun with grief, confusion, and the unbearable weight of loss. It had transformed into discovery, determination, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. Along the way, I had faced threats, intimidation, and doubt, not just from the hospital, but from my own moments of fear and uncertainty. Yet, through it all, I had learned the power of perseverance, of refusing to accept injustice, and of finding strength in the face of unimaginable betrayal. I thought of Ernest's gentle smile, his unwavering kindness, and the life we had shared, and I realized that my fight had become a tribute to him, not just a pursuit of justice, but a continuation of his values: integrity, compassion, and care for others. In exposing the truth, I honored the man I loved and ensured that his legacy would extend far beyond our personal grief. By the time the criminal cases concluded, several staff members faced legal consequences, suspensions, fines, and in some instances, prison sentences. The hospital, forced to confront its culture of negligence, underwent sweeping reforms. Policies were rewritten, oversight committees established, and mandatory training to prevent the kind of negligence that had stolen my husband's life. I knew these measures wouldn't undo the past, wouldn't bring Ernest back, but they could protect others, and somehow that knowledge offered a fragile kind of peace. As I close this chapter, I want to leave a message for anyone who may be facing similar injustice. Your voice matters. Your vigilance matters. Speaking up is not just an act of courage, it is a shield for those who may follow. Ernest's story was tragic,
but it sparked reform, exposed corruption, and gave hope to others. That is the legacy I carry forward, a legacy of truth, resilience, and unwavering dedication to justice. Because sometimes the smallest act, the decision to question a medical error, to dig a little deeper, to refuse silence, can change the course of many lives. And I, a widow turned activist, will continue to honor that truth for as long as I live. Have you or someone you know ever questioned a system that seemed untouchable? Share your story in the comments. I want to know how far these stories reach.